who is incredibly claustrophobic, terrified of being trapped and just hates the tube, I sure do enjoy forcing myself to research videos about those things all too often and just sending myself into an anxiety spiral. I think I always go into these things thinking it's going to help quell my anxiety, as with so much of my life, I think if I can learn about it, I can prevent it happening to myself. But the slice of history we're going to be talking about today is heartbreaking, it's dark and painful, and it didn't help. Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. Today I want to share with you the story of the Moorgate tube crash that happened here in London on the 28th of February 1975. A crash that to this day has no reasonable explanation. It's still a complete mystery as to why this happened, and it's likely we'll never get any solid answers as to it. Officially, the cause of the accident is listed as driver failed to stop, but we don't know why that was. There's never been any truly viable explanation to the worst accident during peacetime in London Underground history. 56-year-old Leslie Newson was the driver that day on the Northern Line 272 train, a train with 6 cars carrying 300 passengers to Moorgate on the Highbury branch of the Northern Line. Moorgate was the end of the line, meaning that instead of the underground tunnel continuing on, there was simply a very short safety tunnel about 66 feet long, and then a black concrete and brick wall to greet the train. The idea obviously being that the train stopped well before reaching this concrete wall, letting passengers disembark or embark, and then it heads back in the same direction in which it came. But that isn't what happened during rush hour on the 28th of February 1975, approaching Moorgate station at 8:46 AM. For reasons still unknown, the train failed to slow down. 800 metres from Moorgate, the train passed through a green signal, and normally drivers, including Leslie, would slow down at this point at the 800-metre signal and begin to coast into the upcoming station. But that didn't happen this time. At 400 metres, the train passed through another green signal and again failed to slow down. Then the train went through a crossover point, travelling 35 miles per hour instead of the usual 15. It's at this point that people started to realise that something was really going wrong, but there was nothing that could be done to stop it. And then the train barreled straight through the station, it hit the sand drag and smashed straight into the 1.5 metre thick brick and concrete wall. Immediately upon impact, the driver's cab was crushed and the first 3 carriages were pretty much destroyed. These carriages were 52 feet long each, and those first 3 carriages receiving the most impact from the crash would be compacted into just 78 feet. The first carriage upon impact was forced upwards into the roof of the safety tunnel, as the second carriage forced itself underneath. The front of the third car would then lift up over the rear end of the second car, causing the front to be crushed, but the rear end of the third carriage for the most part did remain intact. The last 3 carriages would obviously feel the impact of the crash and many people were injured, but it was nowhere near as bad as the first 3. The first call to the emergency services came in just before 9 AM. According to Jonathan Mayo's minute-by-minute account of this tragedy for the Daily Mail, driver or motorman as they're called on the tube, Leslie Newson, was a Dunkirk veteran. He woke up at 4:15 AM that morning, as always, to get ready for work. He lived in a flat in New Cross in southeast London, and he had the same morning routine every day. He woke up, he shaved in the kitchen, he had a cup of tea for breakfast, he kissed his wife on the forehead and headed out for work, carrying his bag with him containing milk, a flask of tea, instant coffee and his driver's instruction book. He caught the number 21 bus to Drayton Park Station where the Northern Line train to Moorgate began, and everyone who interacted with Leslie that morning said that he was acting completely normally. Leslie had joined London Transport 6 years previously as a guard, and eventually he became a driver, where he was said to be cautious, cheerful and friendly. In the 13 days leading up to this tragedy, Leslie had driven into Platform 9 at Moorgate Station 121 times without any incident. Leslie was described as quiet and unassuming. He was very happy with the smaller things in life. He had a good relationship with his wife and 2 daughters. Once he'd arrived at Drayton Park Station that morning, Leslie headed to the crew room to make himself another cup of tea, a true Brit, and he chatted with a fellow driver who asked to borrow some sugar. Leslie remarked, "Go easy with it, I'll want another cup of tea when I come off duty," suggesting that he did intend to see the other end of his shift alive that day. His first journey of the day began at 6:56 a.m, before which all the usual checks had taken place and everything was in order. A guard called Bob Harris was actually assigned to Leslie's train that morning, but he was running late, so another driver called Motorman Rosario volunteered to fill in until Harris turned up. All motormen or drivers had to have worked as guards beforehand, so they could sort of do the jobs interchangeably. Rosario and Leslie didn't really know each other, but he would later say that Leslie seemed fit and normal that morning. There was nothing strange to report about his behaviour. Just after 7 a.m. though, Harris took over. He turned up finally. Harris and Leslie chatted a bit during their 3 journeys together that morning, and again he said everything seemed to be as normal. Now, being a tube driver is a bit of a repetitive job, especially on a short part of the Northern Line like this. By 8:39 a.m, Leslie had driven between Drayton Park and Moorgate 3 times already, and he was about to embark on his 4th journey before his first proper break at 9 a.m. This is obviously peak rush hour commuting, so people are desperately trying to rush to get the train. Most people trying to squeeze onto the first 3 carriages so they're closer to the exit once they reach Moorgate, which is probably the busiest station on this part of the line. Because of this, the train ended up departing 30 seconds late from Drayton Park as commuters squeezed on. At 8:45 a.m, the train reached Old Street, its penultimate stop, and it said that there Leslie checked the brakes, something done often by the drivers. They were constantly checking everything was in working order. As the train departed Aldgate, there were around 300 passengers on board. As the train begins the journey, Guard Harris gets bored and he walks towards the rear of the train to see if anyone left a newspaper anywhere that he could read. Now, it's around this point in the journey that the driver would usually shut off the power to the train for just a few seconds, so the train would begin to coast and then they brake to bring down the speed. But instead, the train just continued to accelerate. Now, Harris probably realised something was up around the same time as the signaller would have done at Moorgate, but he used the wrong end of the carriage to pull the emergency brake. Not that he really would have had any time to do so anyway, this all happened in a split second. And then he was thrown to the floor as the train made impact with the wall. Anthony and Caroline Board, who were waiting on the platform at Moorgate, would later say that they saw the train approach through the tunnel and could tell immediately that it was travelling way too fast. As it zoomed past them, they saw Leslie Newson sitting at the controls at the front. He was sitting upright and not moving at all, just staring straight ahead. He didn't seem to be reacting at all to how fast the train was going. Several other eyewitnesses would also corroborate this report. Leslie didn't move. After impact, Guard Harris opened the doors to the rear carriages so the uninjured passengers could escape onto the platform into the cloud of soot emerging from the safety tunnel. A lot of passengers in the rear carriages didn't even really have a concept of how bad this was. Some didn't realise at all until they saw the reports in the newspaper the very next day. One man was apparently determined not to arrive at work dirty, so he avoided the soot cloud as best he could and just continued heading to the office. Another woman was apparently overheard saying she wanted to get compensation for her ruined clothes. These people were incredibly lucky that they didn't have a clue what was going on in the first few carriages. Death and destruction, people injured beyond imagination, trauma that would sit with them for the rest of their lives. Even if victims weren't physically injured, they were emotionally, mentally, psychologically. This would stay with them forever. At 8:54 a.m, ambulances from nearby St Bart's Hospital would start to arrive as the surviving passengers, made their way to street level. The paramedics made their way underground as 4 minutes later the first fire engines also pulled up. Nobody above ground had any clue the absolute horror that was awaiting them down below. Nobody was prepared for what they were about to see. I mentioned the trauma of the survivors, but that would have been the same for the first responders here as well. They must have seen things that no human ever wants to see. In the front carriages, victims had been thrown feet in the air, getting trapped between seats, up on the luggage rails. They were trapped underneath dead bodies and other victims. Some had been caught in the mangled metal of the carriage, resulting in many people needing body parts amputated in order to be pulled out from the wreckage. The recovery operation here was said to be of unprecedented difficulty, with journalist Gerard Kemp from the Daily Telegraph writing that the scene was a horrible mess of limbs and mangled iron. He was the only journalist who was allowed into the tunnel. All in all, the rescue effort ended up taking 4 whole days. The firemen had to crawl through narrow cracks to reach survivors, and the heat was unimaginable. I think any of us who have ever been in the London Underground will know how hot and clammy it can get down there. Yes, even in February. You're underground, there are lots of bodies, it gets really warm. Although in more recent years TfL have done some things to try and combat the heat in the tunnels, especially in the summer, there wasn't really much that could be done in 1975. At this point, the Underground relied on trains pushing and pulling the air through the tunnels, and obviously with this crash, London Underground had to stop trains running through this station, through Moorgate. So it got really hot. The fire brigade here really did have their work cut out for them when it came to this rescue mission. They likened the dark safety tunnel to crawling through the coal mines. The air was thick with heat and it was just unbreathable. Some rescuers described it like opening the door of an oven. As the days went on, the dead bodies in this carnage started to decompose, adding an unthinkable stench to these already unworkable conditions. In the first 2 carriages, 40 people were trapped, and they had to meticulously free each person as fast but as safely as they could. And thanks to the high risk of fire and the oxygen situation in the tunnel, they couldn't use their usual equipment to cut through the metal, so instead they had to rely on hacksaws and just sheer strength. 13 hours and 19 minutes after the collision, the last survivor was rescued. After that, it was just bodies. It took hundreds of police, ambulance staff, members of the Salvation Army, and more than 1,300 firemen 4 days to retrieve everyone, dead or alive. Although there's no doubt the rescue services did everything they could here, there was one major downfall in their mission: the fact that their radios didn't work underground. This platform was 21 metres underground underneath layers of soil and concrete, so their radios just couldn't get signal, making communication so much harder than it needed to be. I'm pretty sure this isn't an issue they fixed either after this, because if I recall correctly, this was still a problem in 1987 when there was a fire outbreak at King's Cross. At Moorgate, if rescuers had a message that needed to be passed to the surface, they had to essentially play a game of telephone, runners passing the message on to the next until it got to the correct person. There's one story of a doctor requesting some Entonox, which is a pain-killing gas, but by the time the message got above ground, he was apparently asking for an empty box. We don't know if any lives were lost because of this communication delay, but it certainly didn't help. It was just an added complication that nobody really needed. Out of the approximately 300 passengers aboard the train that morning, 43 people would be killed and 75 people were injured enough that they required medical hospital attention. The last person to be reached 4 days after the accident was driver Leslie Newson, trapped in the driver's cab. There just wasn't any other way to reach him other than working their way through the wreckage, and he was obviously at the very front. His cab had been compacted from 3 feet deep to just 10 inches. Regardless, his body was found still sitting as if he was driving the train, in his chair with his left hand very close to the brake and his right arm hanging down to the right of the master controller, which included something called the dead man's handle. A dead man's handle or dead man's switch is a safety switch on a piece of machinery, such as on trains, that's designed to be activated or deactivated if the human operator becomes incapacitated, whether that's through death, loss of consciousness, or being forcibly removed from the controls. It's meant to be somewhat of a fail-safe. It needs pressure at all times, and if it loses pressure, the handle shoots up and gives emergency brake application and cuts the power. The fact that the train didn't stop or slow down at any point suggests that Leslie's hand remained on it the entire time. Investigations showed that the train was still motoring anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 seconds before impact. In the immediate days after the crash, investigators got to work looking into the mechanics of the train. If something had gone wrong, they were going to find out what it was. The braking system here was electromagnetic, so each carriage had 16 brake cylinders that ran on electricity, and there was also a fail-safe system in place as well. So if this braking system failed, the backup could be put into action by the driver, or by a passenger or guard pulling the emergency cord. But every single bit of braking equipment on this train was tested. The braking equipment from the cab was even put in another train and tested under emergency conditions, and it all worked perfectly fine. Every single possible mechanical avenue was looked into here, and the train was in perfect working order. If Leslie had tried to brake the train, it would have braked, which suggests that he didn't. The crash could only have come down to driver error. But how? What exactly happened in that cab? Leslie's body was removed at 8:05 p.m. on the 4th of March, with the post-mortem taking place that very same evening. Obviously, by this point on, 4 days on, investigators are already looking at a number of possibilities as to why the crash had happened, and one of their main theories was that Leslie may have had a medical emergency that rendered him unconscious or unable to react. A heart attack or a stroke, maybe, something like that. However, the pathologist found no evidence of any physical condition that may have caused this. His cause of death was found to be shock from multiple injuries on an otherwise perfectly healthy man. But what about alcohol? Maybe he'd been drinking. Initial findings showed no drugs or alcohol in his bloodstream, and there was no evidence of liver damage from heavy drinking either. Friends and family also backed this up, saying Leslie was never a big drinker. At the later coroner's inquest though, it was found that a deeper analysis of Leslie's kidneys showed that his blood alcohol level at the time of the post-mortem was 80 milligrams per 100 millilitres, which is spot on the legal driving limit here in England. A lot of people took this and ran with it. This was clearly evidence that Leslie was drunk at the time of the crash was his fault, and that was that. However, of course, it wasn't quite that straightforward. Leslie had been decomposing in his cab in intense heat for 4 days before he was recovered. There was every chance this blood alcohol level was simply the product of this decomposition, naturally produced in the blood after death. There was a lot of back and forth about this at the inquest, but loads of witnesses were called in, and not a single colleague he spoke to that morning suspected that he'd been drinking. His behaviour was completely normal, and by all means, he wasn't an alcoholic. In the end, it was generally accepted that the blood alcohol level was the result of decomposition, which put everyone back at square one. Why had this happened? Leslie was described at the inquest as a quiet man with orderly habits. He wasn't sickly, he wasn't a daydreamer, he was a conscientious driver of both cars and trains. He never so much as ran a red light. He never drank heavily or excessively. His wife said he wasn't depressed, and he loved his job. Since he'd started his job, he'd only had 2 days of absence due to sickness, and he'd been passed as medically fit. He was also found with £270 in his jacket pocket, as after work he intended to go and buy his daughter a car. That's the equivalent of over £2,000 cash today. His notebook was also found in his bag in the cab, in which he wrote consistent notes on how to deal with train defects and how to be a better driver. He'd covered both his notebook and the training manual in plastic to protect them from damage, which would be used in the subsequent investigation to point out how conscientious he was, how much he respected his job on the railway. Leslie cared enough to make notes constantly and also take steps to protect said notes. Despite all this, people did suspect suicide in the early days of the investigation, and whilst you never truly know what's going on in someone else's head, that was deemed to be highly unlikely in this case. As far as anyone knew, Leslie was happy, he was making future plans. He made that comment to his colleague that morning about not using all the sugar because he wanted a tea after his shift. He had all that money in his pocket to go and buy his daughter a car. Suicide just went against all the evidence in this case. And suicide in a way such as this is something incredibly rare. It's not all that often that people decide to end their own lives in a way that they know is also going to end multiple others as well. Usually, not always, but usually, people who decide to end their own lives in such a way have a grudge against society. They want revenge. That just wasn't Leslie. He was a simple man who loved his wife and his daughters, who woke up at 4 a.m. every morning to head to his job that he enjoyed, and he wanted to go and buy his daughter a car after work. That's not a man who had homicidal intentions. By all accounts, Leslie made no efforts to protect himself against the incoming crash. He didn't lift his hands to protect his face, something which most people would do even unconsciously to protect themselves. Even those most intent on ending their own lives will probably make some sort of movement to protect their face. So the next theory explored was that he was daydreaming. The line that Leslie was driving on that day was a route that a lot of the more experienced drivers didn't really like because it was very short and monotonous. That same route, day in, day out, got boring very quickly. Is it possible that Leslie really did just check out whilst driving on this boring route? Maybe he was daydreaming about going to buy his daughter that car. Maybe he just got distracted. I'm sure we've all had it before whilst we're driving. I mean, I've arrived at locations before just on autopilot, realising that I've checked out for the entire drive. Not that it's something that happens often, don't worry, but I know I'm not the only one that happens to, especially on those kind of repetitive drives that you do every day. You just do it on autopilot. Was Leslie checked out and just didn't notice what was happening until it was too late? Well, the evidence points out some flaws in this story as well. The seat that Leslie would have been sat on in the driver's cabin didn't have any restraints, there were no armrests, and part of the journey into Moorgate station included going over a crossing, something which kind of caused the train to lean to one side. If Leslie was daydreaming and the train sort of leant to one side and he started to fall, that should have caused him to jolt awake. Maybe he would have fallen to one side and the pressure would have come off the dead man's handle, causing the emergency brakes to come into action. Others also point out the fact that the flashing lights as he came to the station should also have broken him out of any kind of trance he was in. It was very hard not to pay attention to them. Some also suspect that he might have fallen asleep. Like I said, it's very warm and repetitive inside those tunnels, enough to make you sleepy for sure. But again, the jolt of the crossing should have woken him up if that was the case, and his hand never lost pressure on the handle. Which brings us to another theory, that he may simply have been confused. For weeks leading up to this crash, maintenance work had meant that the tunnel lights had been on leading up to Moorgate station, but this work had recently finished and the works had moved on to the next section of the tunnel. Maybe Leslie got confused on that final journey, or perhaps he was simply driving on autopilot. He was so used to the tunnel light being there to indicate the station up ahead that when he didn't see the lights that day, he simply thought he was coming into a different station or maybe had longer, and so he didn't brake. Those underground tunnels all look the same. It's dark and disorientating being down there day after day. If Leslie got confused or lost, he may well have simply not noticed what he was doing. The brick wall at the end of the safety tunnel at Moorgate was painted black, which seems like an obvious oversight now. Looking ahead, Leslie may well have thought this was simply more tunnel. Had the wall been painted white or yellow, something bright, maybe he would have realised. Maybe. This does seem unlikely, I know. You'd think a driver would know never to make this mistake. But at the end of the day, even the people in charge of our lives are still just people, humans who do make mistakes, just like the rest of us. Some mistakes are just more fatal than others. Regardless, I do think that Leslie would have realised before the moment of impact and maybe raised his hand to protect his face. But like I said, he didn't. But what if Leslie did have some kind of physical medical emergency that the post-mortem just didn't pick up on? The two most prevalent theories here both involve the brain, an organ that remains a mystery to even neuroscientists, people who dedicate their whole lives to it. The inquest mentioned possibilities of both transient global amnesia and akinetic mutism. The latter, akinetic mutism, is a rare neurological disorder characterised by the presence of a level of consciousness but a big decrease in goal-directed behaviour and emotions, which is often the result of severe frontal lobe injury but can also just happen the result of bacterial or viral infections. Maybe Leslie hit his head in the cabin before his last drive, not thinking anything of it, but maybe it caused a brain injury. We don't know. Akinetic mutism is often compared to locked-in syndrome. The body just stops being able to do anything, even though your brain is very much still conscious. The likelihood of this just happening to Leslie at this moment is incredibly slim, but it's not impossible. However, the first option, transient global amnesia, does strike me as borderline more likely, defined as a temporary but almost total disruption of short-term memory. A person in a state of TGA would exhibit no other signs of impaired cognitive function, but can only recall the last few moments of consciousness as well as a few very old memories. These episodes of TGA can generally last 2 to 8 hours, and you generally hope they don't happen in a moment of life and death such as this, but it can happen. Nobody knows what really causes TGA, it really can just happen in the moment. The leading hypotheses are epilepsy or an epileptic event, bad blood circulation to the brain, or some sort of migraine-like phenomenon. In about a third of cases of TGA, there's thought to be some sort of event leading up to it, like vigorous exercise, swimming in cold water, or other temperature changes, or like an emotionally traumatic or stressful event. None of those could really be applied to Leslie, but like I said, that's only in a third of cases. 2/3 of cases have nothing leading up to them, they just happen. I tried to research whether or not there'd be any evidence of TGA found in an autopsy, but I couldn't find any solid answer, or any answer at all for that matter. So if anyone medical knows, then please comment. If TGA, transient global amnesia, was indeed the cause here, I would be leaning towards the fact that it might have been epilepsy that brought on this attack, perhaps due to the flashing lights of the tunnel as the train sped through it. Out of all the possible theories here, I would lean towards TGA being what happened, but at the end of the day, the answers here died in that cab with Leslie. The official conclusion is that the accident was solely due to a lapse on the part of the driver, and that was all we have. In the years leading up to the accident, London Underground had been installing speed controls at several locations after the death of a driver in 1971. By the time of the Moorgate crash, 12 of 19 intended locations had been installed. In July 1978, approval was given for what they called Moorgate Protection, or TETS, train entering terminal stations, and basically they had to be put at all dead-end stations or manually driven lines. In the years leading up to this accident, London Underground had already been installing speed controls at several locations after the death of a driver in 1971. By the time of the Moorgate crash, 12 of 19 intended locations had been installed already. In July 1978, approval was given for what they called Moorgate Protection, or TETS, train entering terminal stations, so put at all dead-end stations on manually driven lines. On platform 9, 3 timed train stops were installed, so one at the crossing, the second at the start of the platform, and the third halfway down the platform. If a train goes over these at more than 12.5 miles per hour, the emergency brake is automatically applied. By 1984, this system was in place in all applicable locations. The speed limit was also reduced to 10 miles an hour, down from 15 miles per hour, something that still stands today. As with so much of history, so many of the topics I talk about, this seems like something very obvious now. I mean, of course, these platforms should have fail-safes on them to ensure the train stops in case something goes wrong. But you don't think of that until the worst happens. We see it time and time again, don't we? Like, you can do your best to predict all possible outcomes, but you're never going to be able to prevent them all, or at least convince the higher-ups to prevent them until tragedy like this strikes, and then it's suddenly obvious what you need to do. I say it all the time on my channel, but people moan about health and safety going mad constantly, but every health and safety rule put in place has somebody's death or serious injury behind it. Every rule is in place for a reason, because somebody has got hurt. Thank you so much for tuning in today and spending this time with me and learning about this small slice of history. I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.